Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. The player with the best performance rating in the Women's Olympiad in Chennai was Oliwia Kiolbasa from Poland. She scored 9.5 out of 11 on board 3 and won the gold medal on board 3. In fact, she had 9 out of 9, but then had a little hiccup at the end. But anyway, an excellent performance. I wanted to show you one of her games. And this is against Rameshbabu Vaishali. Well, many of you will know Vaishali's brother, Pragnananda, but Vaishali, a very strong player in her own right. She's an international master already and had a good tournament actually, playing for India. She scored 7.5 out of 11, but in this game, she met her match. So I'm going to plunge in. 41st move, we're in the end game already. I don't often concentrate on end games, but I really enjoyed this one. Some really nice touches in this one. It's a very typical rook and pawn endgame, where we have 3 pawns against 3 pawns on the king side, and then an extra pawn for white on the queen side. And you can see that Vaishali has the rook in the best defensive position behind the passed pawn. And white already has a choice to make here, and a very important decision actually. Do you protect the pawn from in front, or do you protect from the side? And that changes strategy greatly. Obviously, with the rook in front of the pawn, then you can advance that pawn. With the rook at the side, that can give more options to bring the king over, because the rook might be able to defend pawns on the king side. And then the idea with the rook on b3 would be to bring the king over to b4. It's very hard to judge in a practical game which is best. I think objectively this position should be a draw anyway. But yeah, it's always a tough decision. But in any case, Kiolbasa played rook a5. g5. Now that looks like a good move to sort of straighten out these pawns and to stop white expanding on the king side. And the king emerges, king g3. Rook a2, the rook remains active. Now this is why the rook is in its best position behind that pawn, because it can also look across at the king side. That king would like to support the a pawn, but then black will be able to take at least one of the pawns, and then black will have counterplay on the king side by creating a passed pawn. King f3, king h7, and black's king comes up the board. And now you can see, yeah, the king would like to come across, but rook takes pawn, and black should be okay there. So rook a7, the white rook activates, but king a5 anyway. And well, here you just have to appreciate that if white takes that pawn on the king side, 3 versus 2, generally it's not enough to win. That should be a draw. Black should hold. g3 from white, king e5, and now white changes strategy. Instead of playing the king across, which isn't good enough, the king comes back. And now Kiolbasa decides, okay, I'm just going to advance the a pawn. And the king comes back home. And there we go, the a pawn advances, pawn to a6. You can see that rook very well placed, preventing white's king from coming forward, but also looking at the rook, behind that passed pawn. And that prevents the white rook from moving away. This is white's problem. In fact, that rook on a7 isn't very active. Black's rook is far more active. King g6, Vaishali waits, rook a8, king f5, king f1. And now Kiolbasa makes a very committal move. And it's not quite clear how white should make progress here. it's clear that the king can't move across because that pawn would be taken and black gets counterplay on the king side. So what do you play? A7. Very committal, because that means the rook on A8 now cannot move because the rook will take the pawn. Having said that, putting the pawn on A7 sets up lots of tricks as well, and that's what we're about to see. King G6. Well, first of all, we should note that with the pawn on A7, if the king ever comes out like this, allowing a check, then white wins instantly. Rook check, and then the pawn goes home. So Vaishali just has to be a little bit careful. Make sure the king has cover here. There's no check on G8, obviously. So the king, white's king, comes across. Now, I think black's best defensive method is to play the king to H7 and then to play the pawn to G6, and that just gives the king a little bit more room, and then just sit with the king on G7. I mean, white has tricks in that variation, but I think that's the simplest way to go. But king F7 played instead. And now if the white king just comes over to attack the rook, then the rook just stays behind the pawn. Let me just give an example of that. So if rook A6, well, let's suppose the king travels over, the rook stays behind the pawn, and basically that king just gets checked. Gets checked away from the A pawn, and basically the king would just have to come back home, and well, the rook always just heads behind the A pawn so the rook can't move. But here's where Kiolbasa came up with a very interesting idea. Pawn to H4. Now, I'm going to hand things over to you. It's time for you to have a little think. Black to play, how would you defend this position? Now, I'm not looking for just one move here. You've got to think of a defensive strategy. I'll have a little slurp of tea. Cheers, in my beautiful Brentford mug. And you have a little think. This is not easy to defend. And Vaishali went wrong. Now this is move 57, so it's quite possible that they were already playing on the increment. Certainly, time would have been tight. King G6 was played. I think this is still a draw. And now King G6. And after H5 check, well, don't take that pawn, because rook check, followed by getting a queen. Still got to get this one right. I think, so where does the king go, basically? It's a tricky one. There's all kinds of tricks in this kind of position. So, for example, if king G5, then H6 is a winning move. If that's taken, then check. And if pawn takes pawn, then rook G8 check and get a queen. So where does the king go? Does it go back to H7? Looks very secure. In fact, this is going to be winning for white. Let's just see how. Well, first of all, let's bring the king over. Of course, that rook cannot stray from the A file. If rook takes pawn, then rook B8 and you get a queen. So lots of checks. The king marches up the board. And then F4, you put the pawn on F5. And then you come over with the king. The rook has to stay behind the A pawn. And then the king moves all the way over to F7. And this is a winning position. It's a nice journey. Black, of course, cannot move the king. If the king comes up, then rook check. So black has to wait passively. And now the winning move. Pawn to H6. If that's taken, then rook H8. And if pawn takes, king takes f6, and this is winning. You just play the king to e7 and advance the pawn. And actually, there is no defense here. This pawn is too slow. But coming back here, there is still a draw, and that's with king f5. That's the move you have to see, basically. You have to realize that the king is actually safe here. If it steps out of line, if it steps to one of these squares, white will win with a check or a pawn to h6. But after king f5, in fact, the king is secure. The king can come over, but actually black's king, so long as there's a pawn here, the king is safe. And in fact, black finds counterplay. This pawn can advance, and black is okay. That's the rough idea anyway. So after h4, just to recap, black should take and then bring the king out. That's actually very important. The king needs to come out, and it comes out to f5. If the king doesn't come out, then, well, we'll see what happens. Let's have a look. So in the game, king g6 was played, and this is a mistake. h5 check. Now, what happens if the king pops out to f5? Well, let's play f3 to prevent the king coming forward, and then white's king is going to go on a little journey all the way over to e7, f7, and take on g7. And actually, there's not a lot that black can do about that. The rook, well, basically it's going to be driven back. The king will be able to come up the board and make it through to e7 and f7. And that is winning. Of course, the king cannot come back because of the check here. So h5 check. The king came back to f7. Same story. If the king came back to h7, then we'd be able to put the pawn on f5 and bring the king all the way over to f7. So king f7. Now, how does white win this one? It looks like h6 is winning, because if pawn takes pawn, then rook h8, and we've got this old trick like that. But after h6, king g6 takes, and black is probably holding that position. But first of all, f4. Pawn takes, yeah, this could have transposed to the other line, which is why I didn't look into it. And here, basically, black's king is stuck. That g-pawn can't advance. Well, for the sake of argument, let's look at this. I mean, actually, h6 is just winning. But if that wasn't working, then this also wins. And that old check. So g6 is impossible. And if black just waits, f5, and now h6 is winning because the king can no longer come to g6, and we've got this old trick. Followed by, yeah, rook takes pawn and rook h7 check. So after this, Vaishali played f5 to stop that white pawn advancing. But this is actually a very well-known position, or type of position with the pawn here. This is known to be winning for white. In fact, h6 is winning. This is a well-known theoretical position because, well, let me show this to you. This wins like this. The rook is forced back. King comes up the board. Here, king comes there, attacking the pawn. King can't defend because of rook g8 check. So rook check, king e6. And this position is Zugzwang. Zugzwang, one of my favorite states of being in chess, one of my favorite words in chess, Zugzwang. However black moves, black loses. So if the rook moves away, of course you take the pawn. If the king moves to h7, then the king just invades, and that's Zugzwang again. The king has no decent moves. King up is mate, and the rook cannot move away from the A file because the rook will move, and otherwise the rook has to move and then king takes pawn. Well known. In fact, something very similar happens in the game. In fact, Kiolbasa decided not to do that. Instead, she went round the other way. I mean, there's nothing the rook can do. Basically, the king can't be prevented from moving up the board to g5. And yeah, this wins very simply. Very, very similar in a way. h6 is the breakthrough. And the king really is stuck here. And I'll check. So we've got exactly the same position actually. If rook a5, then rook h8. That's trick again with a skewer. King g7, king takes pawn. And this is, again, a well-known theoretical position, which is winning for white. In fact, the pawn doesn't even need the assistance of the king. I'll show you. This is the game continuation. f5. And here we go. Winning move for white. Well-known idea. f6 check. So if rook takes pawn, then the pawn queens on the next turn. And if king takes pawn, rook check, and again, you make a queen. I really like that endgame. Some very interesting ideas, and should be a draw, but it just shows how complex rook and pawn endgames are, even in these positions, which are, well, close to being sort of well-known theory. But here there's just that little wrinkle, that's just a slight difference. And Vaishali goes wrong in this important position. So the draw was like this. Takes, king g6, h5 checking, king f5. It's always difficult to know, do you drop the king back or do you move it forward? Here, moving it forward was the correct idea. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching.